continuing with our theme of innovation, creativity, and adaptability, we're really excited to close out the symposium today with a great session this morning. I'm really honored and delighted to be able to introduce my good friend, Dr. Jay Baruch, as our keynote speaker this morning. One of the best things I did in my time when I was at Brown University was hire Dr. Baruch. It was the early 1990s, mid-1990s, and he came into my office and we were talking about his aspirations to improve the realm of medical education through creativity and innovation. And I was very happy to open a slot for him, especially since he liked working night shifts, which not a lot of other people did. So I snapped him up, and he has just thrived in that environment at Brown. He's risen to become professor of emergency medicine. He has been the longstanding director of the Medical Humanities and Bioethics Scholarly Concentration in the medical school there. His innovation and creative spirit has just moved all over the campus and throughout Rhode Island and really through many other institutions. He has been the proverbial, kind of cross-department, cross-schools, cross-universities with his humanities and ethics and creativity efforts. He runs the creative medicine. He founded and runs the creative medicine series at Brown, which is a really fascinating series. He's as you'll find out, a great scholar, a great speaker, and also a great writer. And if you go to jbaruch.com, I'm plugging for him. If you just look at the essays that he's written recently and just some of the titles, it'll show you where his active mind goes. So in New England Journal of Medicine, a piece called When Sensitivity is a Liability. In British Medical Journal, a piece called Opioids and Pain in the ED, a Narrative Crisis. In Stat News, a piece called Stuck in the Tornado of Life, a Patient's Chaos Narrative. In the Hastings Center Report, Why Won't My Patient Act Like a Jerk? And in Cognoscenti, When Loneliness is the Emergency. And another piece, Can More, quote, Not Knowing, end quote, Make Us Better Physicians? So I would encourage you to read some of these essays. They're really provocative, really interesting. He's written 2 books of short stories, one called 14 Stories, Doctors, Patients, and Other Strangers, and his more recent book, What's Left Out. These are both award-winning short story books. And he's contributed in lots of other ways in the writing realm, but if you're looking for some interesting reading, go to his site and look at some of his pieces and buy his books. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Jay for his presentation, Beyond Comfort Zones, Creativity as a Critical Skill in Academic Medicine. Jay, welcome to Michigan, kind of, and we're really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's so great to visit Michigan from my bedroom, my office in my bedroom, wearing shorts and a collared shirt, by the way. It's really an honor to be here. I want to thank Brian and the committee for inviting me. I want to thank Molly and Laura for all their assistance leading up to this point. And I want to thank all of you for sort of taking some of your time. I know how busy we all are, and I'm really grateful for you to sort of show up for this talk. Now, I was sent along like somewhat of a list of who some of the participants are, and you're a very diverse group with a lot of diverse background, coming from a lot of different specialties. You're also in different places in your career, and so I was trying to shape this talk, and I realized that I think what I'm going to try to do is try to share a little bit about my own experience, from my own personal experience as far as how I got into this space, to some examples of some of the projects that I've been involved with, and more importantly, what I learned from them. And hopefully it'll be less prescriptive and more provocative, and help you to think about how you can do your own work in your own realm in a way that's meaningful for you. We were on. Is that supposed to go to continue, Molly? Oh, there you go. Perfect. I can't move the slide. Oh, there you go. Okay. So my goal for one of the themes I'll be sort of traversing in this talk is just a relationship between creativity and, for me, creative writing, and its relationship as sort of like important clinical skills. And so there's a lot that I borrow from the world of writing that really has applied in the world of what we do, of seeing patients. And one of them was one of the rules from the writer Kurt Vonnegut, which many of you have probably read. And he had these rules of writing, which I sort of love. And I think his rules of writing is become one of my rules of education. And when I give talks, it's like, I want to use the time of a total stranger in such a way that he or she will feel that time was not wasted. So I try to shape this talk in a way that hopefully you'll feel it's a good use of your time. I don't have any conflicts of interest, but as you will see during the rest of this talk, as I do have a lot of interesting conflicts, and a lot of these conflicts ended up being sort of like coalescing, and responding to these conflicts became like the basis of my career. And you'll see this coming up shortly. So, like, how did I get into this place? So I actually took a year off in medical school just to write, and felt really badly during that year, because I felt like I was sort of being irresponsible and taking and missing so much. And little did I realize that the best year of my medical school education actually was the year I took off to write a really sort of terrible novel, but to study writing. And I realized this sort of later on, like less so when I was a resident, and more so when I became a young attending, when I realized that like all the traditional skills and expertise that I was prepared for didn't really prepare me for the complexity, the instability, and the uncertainty of clinical practice. And as we all know, and as our students know, and maybe don't acknowledge to us, is that we realize that symptoms don't always point to identifiable disease. The body doesn't always read the same books and journal articles that we do. Diseases and problems don't always have names. The solutions and how to move forward is not always obvious. The stories that patients tell us are wild and unwieldy. And oftentimes, like, their patients' real concerns lay in the landscape, lay hidden in the landscape of their experience. And I use the word landscape purposefully. And I love the idea of sort of how metaphors work and make us think about certain things in terms of another. And at the beginning of the book, A Fortunate Man by John Berger, about a rural physician in England, he starts off by saying landscapes can be deceptive. Sometimes a landscape seems to be less a setting for the life of its inhabitants than a curtain behind which their struggles, achievements, and accidents take place. So, I was trained to solve puzzles, but I realized that medicine involved exploring landscapes. And the reductive nature of medical training, with a strong focus on finding the right answer, not only felt insufficient, but actually felt obstructive, because sometimes I felt like I was actually blaming my patients for not being, a puzzle with a missing piece. And I was trying to basically find that missing piece, and I was getting very upset. And the problem wasn't really trying to find the missing piece, I later learned, but actually, how do I figure out the puzzle board? So patients I discovered, as we all know, were less like less like this puzzle board and more like this Twombly painting. Now, this painting is a painting that hangs in the Royal Allen School of Design Museum, the RISD Museum. And I feel like stepping before this Twombly is more akin to like the experience of stepping before many of the patients, at least the patients that I deal with, the undifferentiated patients in the emergency department. Now, I've been working with the Royal Allen School of Design Museum for like over a decade. And we focus on, and we use museum objects, not as Sarah Gans, who's the head of education at the museum, has written about, like, museum objects are complex bodies of information. And we use them to provoke students to think about how they think. And by getting students and trainees and even attendings to slow down and learn how to look at this Twombly, a few things happen. They learn how to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Um, and it forces students to actually, how do I make sense of non-linear and random information? They get to interrogate how they feel, not just like the cognitive, the cognitive work of trying to make sense of this, but they become aware of how they feel and how their feeling dictates what they choose to look at. Because what you look at, they soon realize, is a choice that we make. And these themes of like, how do we make sense of chaotic experiences, how do, what's our emotional reaction to that, is incredibly relevant to like what we do. And especially we use this particular painting, actually. One exercise actually to get them to think about patient stories, which is like a lot of which is my interest, and what you and what we sort of try to get people to think about is the fact that all knowledge, like stories, there's a space between the stories that patients try to tell us and the stories that we listen to. And there's a space there. And oftentimes what patients are saying is not exactly what we're hearing. And it's not really necessarily about listening. It's a lot of it is about how knowledge and how stories are constructed. And some of the challenges is the fact that we enter stories in the middle, right? And so telling stories, involves choices, choices the patient makes. What information do I include and what can I leave out? How do I give voice to a complicated experience, especially maybe when I don't really necessarily have the language to talk about it? How do I talk about things that are shameful or embarrassing and make me feel incredibly vulnerable? And then, like, how do I sort of get at medical things that are also layered with socioeconomic problems, mental health problems, substance use problems? Like we know this is what we deal with. And all the times we just sort of accept the story, and we do this all the time. I'm guilty of it too. We tell students or trainees, go get the patient's story, as if it's like this thing that you just sort of like, it's like this solid thing, and you go out and you just get it. But it isn't. Like it's this thing that's constructed. And we're actually involved in how the story is created. So one particular exercise that we end up doing with students, and I'm going a little bit granular here for a reason, is like there's no soft landing spots for students or people who look at this thing. Where you decide to start is very different from what someone else might decide to start. And people realize that. And what we've discovered is that the first thing people do is try to like find something recognizable. So are those hearts in the middle of the screen flying off the screen, flying off? Are those butterflies, perhaps? But the thing is, they're trying to find something recognizable. They're trying to find something to latch onto. And part of that is because it comes out of this unease that you're sort of not willing to sort of sit in the uncertainty and the discomfort. And one of the students who was an undergrad who took a course with me and then later was a medical student, wrote about this experience. And she goes, as I stared deeper into the chalkboard scrolls and found myself getting lost and frustrated at the same time. There was so much not said with this piece. There was so much left unclear. It was a mess. Twombly lives in the tension between knowing and not knowing, between communication and the lack of communication. His blackboard scribbles irritated me, and now I believe that is exactly what he intended to do. He forced me to sit in the unknown. So what we try to do is that instead of trying to get people this overarching theme of how to approach this, we ask students to sort of take a small piece of this painting and get small, like, and to draw it, like to find a small corner of this painting that you find interesting and draw and try to replicate, the line and follow the line. And what they soon discover is, and the line is the positive space, the areas that has what they think is visual information. And what they discover is like these childlike scrawls are kind of hard to replicate. Like there's great skill that's involved with this childlike scrawls. And then we have them write to sort of sketch out areas that they think are negative spaces without information. And what they soon discover is they discover texture, they discover dripping, they discover that there's a lot going on in the negative space. The negative space is sort of always relational to the line, but then they realize that actually what they think is negative, what they think is positive, is actually very, very different. And there's actually a lot of stuff going on in the places where they think nothing is happening. we then make analogy or a metaphor from this back to difficult conversations that they've had, and can they draw up the positive space in the conversation? And can they draw up like areas that they think what they would consider negative space, where something perhaps wasn't happening? And can you document and can you draw this in some way? In some way, artistic knowledge, ability doesn't matter. And what they discover is that there's so much going on in a negative space. And they deal with this whole big thing by getting granular, by learning, but by first becoming comfortable in their unease, and then finding ways to sort of get traction. And so students become not just more comfortable with learning how to deal with non-linear and random information, they actually learn to understand a little bit how to communicate from within this unease. They begin to identify their unease. And they also realize that what they choose to look at is actually a process. That's a decision they make even before they think they're making decisions. And that uncertainty and ambiguity are actually rich evidence to be probed rather than problems to be ignored or reduced. So this is important because, this is because to quote someone who I admire greatly, and actually was a mentor of Dr. Zink's in medical school, Catherine Montgomery Hunter, who wrote perhaps the seminal book that sort of launched this idea of sort of medical humanities, narrative medicine, called The Doctor's Stories, where she spent a year. She was an English professor on the wards at Johns Hopkins, studying how stories and how we communicate. And she wrote that clinicians work to perfect the maps of illness, but each patient, each instance of illness is uncharted territory. And thinking about it in this realm, like the portrait of a life in crisis might not look like a portrait, but actually might look like wild and disconnected brushstrokes. The patient in crisis might look more like a Twombly. So how did I sort of learn to sort of deal with this, to deal with these things? And I realized that by necessity, I found myself drawing back on that time and my creative writing skills. Especially early on in my career, I spent a lot of time, I would go to work, do my stuff, and then I'd be writing. I was writing a lot. I was writing every day. And I began to realize that, so creativity was actually something that I felt like I had a sense about. I didn't say I was good at it, but I had a sense about it, and how to work through that. And what I was trying to work through in my creative work was actually, I saw parallels with my clinical work. And so I felt like creativity was a critical skill for working through uncertainty and ambiguity. And in general, just to blow this up a little bit, we know that uncertainty is just something that is not just an idea that we sort of deal with and play around with. It's not an esoteric notion. It actually it impacts patient care. Research shows that physicians who lack tolerance for uncertainty are prone to excessive diagnostic testing. They put their patients at risk for adverse events. Physicians who are uncomfortable with uncertainty are less likely to have conversation with their patients about uncertainty, which compromises our ability to have really authentic shared decision making. And it also has been literature to show that uncertainty and ambiguity is associated with psychological distress in medical students. So this is more than just an esoteric matter of it's a nice thing, it's a good thing. It's actually a critical thing. And so we talk about creativity, and it's so what is this thing called creativity? And I haven't found a definition that truly sort of satisfies. It's been sort of loosely termed as something that you have to bring something into the world of value that didn't exist before, or bringing something that's original that has a purpose. And I think that directedness is kind of important, and it also has been described in ways I think are particularly relevant to clinical care, including making order out of chaos, combining unrelated forms, making unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. But I love, one thing I love, definition that I love or explanation I love is from the journalist Bill Moyers, who had this beautifully, I thought a beautifully empathic viewpoint, where he said, creativity is piercing the mundane to find the marvelous. Creativity is piercing the mundane to find the marvelous. So by sort of leaning on my writing skills, I did a couple of things. A couple of things were accomplished. One was I felt like I was like engaging my voice, like this is who I was. I wasn't trying to be a certain type of doctor or whatever. I realized I was drawing on skills that were mine, um, and and that my patients actually had so much in common with the characters that I were writing at home. You know, characters, you know, usually are very complex people. They're not people who could be easily summed up. They want something. Usually they want something that badly. I mean, stories are about complex characters who want something badly, but then obstacles, you know, obstacles get in the way. And like, that's like, for me, like, that's the paradigm, like, that's the essential paradigm of like, at least what I do in emergency care. It's like usually people want something, they want something and something got in the way. And what's gotten in the way is sometimes their illness, sometimes it's at risk is their identity, sometimes it's their sense of self, sometimes their ability to work, sometimes it's their sense of solitude, but something is getting in the way. And so this, again, the reductionist perspective of practicing medicine is often inadequate to sort of be open to these things. The other thing that writing does is that it's good writing is about moving characters into open spaces. It's not like moving things into something small, but actually you're aware, you're there at the beginning and you're aware at each step as you create a story, and each decision you make opens up to different possibilities. And so, you know, I also think about that in the context of the lives of my patients. Writing is basically it's around, for me, writing. I'm not a good writer. I think I'm a really diligent rewriter, and I rewrite endlessly. And what you discover too is the fact that there were so many times when I thought that I did was like I was done, like this was really good, and someone goes no, and you're like, and I'm like not happy. And I'm not happy, and I'm like more than not happy. And then like 2 days later, you look at it and you go, they're right. It's not done, or I haven't gone deeper, I haven't probed deeper. And they realize that while medicine, like because we try to be efficient, and we're trying to like control quality, and we're trying to like use good evidence, sometimes we're at risk of sort of trying to put people into boxes. And when we're trying to be creative, we're trying to find in which way is this situation different? How can we be unique? How can we find our voice, insert our voice into this? And so the idea is like we have to simultaneously move things into open spaces and think about possibility, but we also have to choose our scenes and choose our challenges and get small and really, really probe that. So how do you get there? And I realized that for me, the remedy for uncertainty is not knowing. And I know this term not knowing is sort of out there in the world. I got introduced to this term by an essay from the sort of the modernist writer, Donald Barthelme, called Not Knowing. And I bring this up for just for a couple of reasons, because he wrote that, you know, writing and art and art making is really a process of dealing with not knowing. And that when an artist or writer begins, he or she is someone who doesn't know what to do, and they must render all this messiness. And he said that not knowing isn't an unfortunate and frustrating part of the creative process. It's actually an essential part of the creative process. Not knowing is crucial to art, and finding problems are critical to not knowing. Problems, you know, shouldn't be considered like a failure on our part. Problems are actually essential. They present opportunities to push our minds in unanticipated directions. He's like, according to Barthelme and many, many others, you know, without problems, there would be no invention. We wouldn't be moving our minds in unanticipated directions. And one thing I thought was very interesting, he said, the more serious the artists are the people who are the more serious problem they decide to undertake. And I think that's really, really important. So not settling for the things that you can that are easy sometimes, but actually really trying to aspire for those problems that are really critical and that really challenge you. So what he said is also akin to what Jerome Bruner, who is a narrative scholar, psychologist, who's done some great writing. I recommend his books immensely. And he said that, great narrative is an invitation to problem finding. It's not a lesson in problem solving. Narrative is deeply about plight. It's about the road rather than the end to which it leads. And I feel like this has several applications to clinical practice. Finding answers. We focus so much on finding answers, and we want our students, we want our learners to have answers. But other times it's not as important. It's like learning how to ask the right questions. Like I found, in my years of being in emergency medicine and going to 20 years of M&M, that oftentimes, I've had the great fortune of working with very, very, very smart people who, like you, who not only know the literature, but are actually creating the literature. And these people, and when things have gone awry, oftentimes it's not necessarily lack of knowledge. It's really smart people who just got the story wrong. And so the smartest people, the best medicine that we have, oftentimes it doesn't work on the wrong story. Story isn't the vehicle towards a diagnosis. It's actually the destination. We start with story. We should be comfortable sort of trying to figure this out. And so for me, it's when people come in with 15 different complaints, it's okay, where do you start? Like a twab, where do I start? And it's hey, walk me through your day. I want to know your day, because what I want to find out is I want to find out what's that exact moment and that caused you to sort of leave what you're doing and coming to the ER. Because coming into the emergency department in that realm is actually a narrative event. That's an event. No one wants to come to the emergency department. And so when you do and you make that decision, that's actually a narrative event. So that's oftentimes where I start. And people actually want to know. They go, you want to know what I did? And then and from seeing them how they played out their day, you also get a better sense of of who they are and their backstory before they decided to come into the emergency department, and you get them in the middle. Narratives about trouble, and oftentimes what has gone awry is many different things, and it leaves us open to those things by asking a little these different types of questions. And story is about struggle. And sometimes not just the struggle to tell the story and the struggle to sort of understand the story, but sometimes recognizing the patient's struggle is what we can offer them. And sometimes that's just the world to be able to do that. And the reason why this is important, at least for me, from my perspective, is that sometimes when we have these unwieldy and challenging stories, we try to make it fit. We try to find an answer for stories that oftentimes don't have answers. And there's a moral dimension to this, because by doing that, we're not really sort of addressing what their real concerns are. And if we sort of give the impression that we're dismissing the patient's story, and in essence, we're also dismissing the storyteller, which I feel is a significant moral harm. And there's also a cognitive dimension to this, which is if you look at some of the cognitive science literature and you read, Daniel Kahneman's work and his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he says, we oftentimes think we make decisions by reasoning. We take issues, we piece them all together, and we logic through it to a conclusion. But oftentimes we actually, whether we realize it or not, we unconsciously get a conclusion. And we look for those details that support the conclusion. And that's stuff that we're doing subconsciously. So what's going on in our mind? And how do we think? And how should we perhaps start giving people permission to think differently? And I love this quote. Linda Barry is if you don't know, is a graphic artist. She's written many books. She's written some fantastic books about actually art making and the courses that she's taught in Wisconsin. And I love the whole quote. She goes, the thing I call my mind seems to be kind of like a landlord that doesn't really know its tenants, which I love. And so how do we get to know our tenants? There's so many, because there's so much noise in there. And I feel like that's sort of the central question. It's one of the central questions of my work. And I, it begins, I think, by we're trying to make things the same. We're trying to find out how, in ways in which people fit, and we're trying to trying to do the right thing. But I feel like this is where humanities and the arts have a role, because the goal is not necessarily to find answers and to find ways in which things are similar, or make us comfortable, but actually, how do we make things strange? How do we make things different and bring different angles into our work, that we begin to think differently, that we begin to slow down? It's not necessarily about slowing down. It's not necessarily about time. It's about having a different angle into our work. This is a scholar, physician whose work I admire immensely, is a former faculty, actually, University of Michigan, on Okuma Guide, and he wrote about sort of how the role of arts and humanities in health professional education is to make strange, to disturb and disrupt one's assumptions, perspectives, and ways of acting, so one can see the self and others and the world anew. And that also shares, common goals of what writing is. One writer wrote how the ability of writers, the test of a writer's power, is to imagine what is not the self, to familiarize the strange, and to mystify the familiar. And I feel like we talk about challenges in the healthcare system, especially now we're all trying to respond to COVID. We think about these big issues and big problems, but sometimes we should actually be thinking about these things like more immediate and more smaller challenges. How can we make things smaller? They might not seem like big problems, but sometimes those smaller things are really what's most interesting. And we're all facing constraints. I look at all this, like what the arts are great at is actually working within constraints, using constraints to sort of think differently. And it requires a couple of things. It requires sort of stepping out of our silos, which means getting to some uncomfortable places, and to take risks and to be curious, and also to realize that what I'm saying is not that medicine can't be evidence-based. I think it has to be evidence-based. It's an evidence-based practice. But we also have to expand what we consider valuable evidence. So I ended up working for the last probably 15, 20 years, actually, work with a range of different artists. I found like, the challenge I've had is like, how do I get people to sort of understand some of the things that I became to understand, at least in my own personal experience as a writer, and how it applies to medicine. Because a lot of it was sort of came through by personal experience. I didn't feel like I could sort of give a talk, teach a course, though I've done plenty of those. I felt like it was important for people to get messy, because it's tough for them to sort of understand sometimes, without sort of being there and and experiencing it firsthand. And so I've worked with, one of my big goals has actually been to just like, who are my partners? Like, who do I partner with? And so, I partnered with the Rhode Island School of Design. You'll see partners with Rhode Island School of Design Museum. I've partnered with artists. I've partnered with dancers. I've partnered with folks from Trinity Rep. And when I come to them, like, I don't come to them as like a physician. I come to them as a writer, trying to figure this stuff out, because I feel like it's not like I want you, like I want this is what I want from you. What has been a goal and an end product of a lot of these projects has been creating a third space and another space where we created things where neither one of us could have actually created it alone. But because of the input and the interactions, we were able to create something new that was unexpected. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of samples of projects that I did, without really going into great detail, but what I learned from them, and some challenges that I had. So to sort of get real about the logistics of doing some of this. So this is one of the first things that I did, and it was called No Innocent. It's a course. It's actually an undergrad RISD course, and Brown has cross-pollination. They can take courses. Brown students can take courses at RISD and get credit. And so we had RISD students, a couple of Brown undergrad students, and we had Brown medical students, and it was a full credit bearing course. It was 3 hours, once a week for 12 weeks, and it was rigorous because we had to get through the RISD curriculum committee. standards. And and I collaborated with a writer, Kelly Auerbach, who's now out in California. She was MFA in writing. She's a novelist, a screenwriter, and our goal was basically to sort of to find ways where with those spaces where artists and medical trainees have in common, whether it's thinking about suffering, whether it's in pain, whether it's thinking about the space between how we look at the body, thinking about the gaze. There was a whole bunch of different things that we felt like each would bring a different perspective on this. And there were a couple of things that we learned is that it was entirely weird and bizarre, and we made people sign up and actually apply for it with an essay, and we had like way too many people for our course, and we originally expected it to be, we capped it at 20. We eventually accepted 27 students, and on the first day, despite that, we had like 58 or 59 people show up trying to get into the course. And it was based on a lot of creative practice. It was the RISD model of sort of making things. And what I learned from this, what we discovered from this, is that the medical students were not comfortable with sort of giving open-ended critique and feedback that was just so natural to the art students' education. And after 3 weeks or 4 weeks, they got there, but they were so used to giving the right answer. They just weren't comfortable sort of just being vulnerable and just throwing ideas out and giving critique and feedback. Though we learned that these medical students were infinitely talented and artistic people, they just somehow were in that zone and they weren't comfortable doing that. We also discovered that if you create something, that they will come, and it was meaningful for them. And so we had a couple of medical students who actually had exams the next day, and they emailed me and said, "Listen, I can't make the session," and they showed up regardless, which was a real lesson for me about sort of how we go ahead and sort of program and create something that is truly interesting. And we've had some of the medical students who took the course basically said that I learned more in medicine in this course than I did in medical school. And we have a very fine medical school. One of the cornerstones of this was conceptions looking at the body, where we had the art students took our medical students through, drawing nudes and drawing quickly and sort of looking. And another element was we had medical students take the art students into the anatomy lab. And we had 3 first-year medical students who just finished anatomy and did well in anatomy. And one thing in our debriefing after that particular session, they confessed to me, because, you know what, I just spent like a semester dissecting the body, and this is the first time I really looked at it, which is incredibly interesting. Another thing we ended up doing with the undergrad student who took that course, who ended up taking, who's a plebe in the program at Brown, where they come as an undergrad and they go immediately get accepted into medical school if they satisfy certain requirements. And so Kevin Louis was a medical student who, very, very talented one, who we ended up creating a course. He wanted to do what I did there, and try to do an elective in the medical school. And it ultimately led into what's called a clinical arts day at the medical school, which is a mandatory half day where students can sign up for some creative activity. That's oftentimes led by faculty who are serious in their creative work, or community artists, people who are doing this work, dancers, filmmakers, writers, whoever. And so why this was important is it got us traction in the medical school, and it ended up being a pretty great success. And it still exists. I don't know what's going on this year, but it's existed in various different forms over the last 10, 11 years. And it created a community. It gave students permission to think this way. I mean, I didn't realize that when I talk about the role of the arts in medicine, a lot of students who have creative backgrounds are like, they feel as though you almost feel them exhale because they have permission to do the things that they feel like it's themselves. They don't have to give up this side of themselves, which is incredible. It also brings community artists into contact with medical students. And a lot of them are doing arts-based work in the community as well. In sort of the sphere of medicine, whether it's music, music and medicine, whether it's doing theater with, in front of patients. And some of these endeavors have actually led to future electives that will end up being taught and future projects between medical students and area artists. And it's something I'm incredibly proud of. It also is something that you end up realizing becomes something becomes part of the mumbo jumbo of curriculum, and where it fits and how it's shaped and where it belongs has morphed over the last number of years. But it's still, as of last, it came on last year, and I don't know about how it's going to work out in COVID. One of the students who was in my scholarly concentration, who was an architect before he went to medical school, did create a course on design and called Design Plus Health, where we put RISD students and Brown medical students together, and it was and we had faculty from the Rhode Island School of Design who were designers, and from the medical school, and I know this goes on at several medical schools. We were one of the earlier ones, and at that time, I think one of the great honors that we had is we had Joyce Lee from Michigan, who actually we had out because she was a lead, someone who we were aspiring for, and what you guys were doing at Michigan was aspirational for us, and so how this course had worked is that, and what we learned from it, what surprised me, is that it's where students learned about empathy. Students who sort of got lectures on empathy, then sort of with an eye roll, who would take in the design course, realize that so much about design is actually is being empathic with the user and understanding the situation of what you're designing for and the people you're designing for and what their needs are and what their limitations are. And the imagination isn't necessarily in the design itself. It's like, what are you designing for, and and the experience you're designing for. And it's something that has existed. We've run into problems as far as that a lot of these design projects require actually a lot of time. And then coordinating the RISD schedules with the Brown medical student schedules was oftentimes a challenge. But it also has managed to have a long life and still exists to this day. And Ravi Sarpatwari, who created this, Brown medical student, actually finished Brown emergency medicine, is now staying on at Brown as a critical care fellow, and he's still involved in the course. I created a course that actually you can take, that was a Brown edX course called Beyond Medical Histories, that talks a lot about sort of the different ways that stories operate in medicine and how we have to think more creatively about stories. And we had people from 90 countries who took this course from many, many different backgrounds, and you can still take it. It's just like we're not at the other end of it. And the reason why I bring this up in this conversation is that it was me, and I had a emergency medicine resident who was actually a poet, Mike Barthman, who you see a picture of, and a couple of designers from Brown, who educational designers, several of whom had come from very creative backgrounds, and I told them, they'd approached me about doing something like this, and I said I wasn't going to do anything like this and talk about creativity without being creative. And I wanted to take chances, and we did this. And we wrote 2 plays for this particular course as examples of different ways stories operate. We drew on a lot of sort of non-medical writings and input to sort of inform what we were doing, and they said that it was the most innovative course that they have developed. And what, to my surprise, is that they have some wonderful people who have done courses, is that they were very excited because I was very open to doing something that was different, and I was very open for their input and how they can sort of work this out. And you realize that sometimes it's kind of really hard to like put your own ego on hold and to actually open yourself up, because there were some times that I'm always open to working with others, but there was some challenge. So certain things that they were like, I don't know. And so it ended up being, I think, imperfect. I think now if I had to do it again, I would maybe do things a little bit differently. But many things, some of the things that I go into greater detail that I brushed on in my presentation exists in this course. So it's really about the power of sort of interdisciplinary work and how you use your collaborators, which will lead me to sort of my last project that I wanted to talk about. And this was actually a statewide project. I was asked to sit on, I was ended up being on the leadership team for this project that was going to produce recommendations to some people in from the Department of Health on art-based interventions and how and different ways that we can integrate art-based interventions into statewide public health policy and practice. And what we ended up doing, and I think that some of the people involved, we could have probably sat down and sort of written this thing in a weekend, but we wanted to make it evidence-based. So we actually created an evidence map. We actually ended up, we got funding. We pulled in a researcher, Stacy Springs from the School of Public Health. And Stacy came in, she was very much a researcher, and she would say, like, I'm not really a creative person. But she was the most fascinating colleague of mine who I work with, who I work closely with to this day. And part of what we were doing was actually, how do you find, like, was not just creating evidence, but how do we go about, thinking about evidence differently because of the participants. So we had basically physicians, we had 20 area artists, we had people from public health, we had people from policy, or people from the arts sort of policy world. And we basically created an evidence map of the literature on sort of arts-based interventions. We had our criteria, and we created this map. And it was up, it's down, but it's now going to be up again. And so part of that was teaching artists how to do research. And it was an incredibly fascinating and wonderful experience. And what's interesting about that is the fact that, there was an IOM report in 2013 about sort of making better systems and the importance of interdisciplinary partnerships. But there's very little out there about, like, how do you do it? Actually, how do you make interdisciplinary partnerships work, especially when the interdisciplinary partners are artists, And so, we ended up meeting a couple of obstacles, along the way. And one was empirical obstacles. Our team not only they come into this project with different disciplinary frames, and also different values on what counts as evidence and why. And so we had to bridge rigorous evidence with critical outcomes that sometimes are really sort of difficult, and if not impossible to measure. Like, how do we measure what is measurable and what is not measurable, but still valuable, especially when these artists, oftentimes the evidence that we were coming up with had to do with the work that they were doing. Like, there wasn't good evidence in their field, and sometimes they became a little bit self-conscious about that. So we had to create a space where rigorous evidence and creativity can coexist. There also was a therapeutic bias, meaning that I think a lot of people think about the arts and arts-based work as sort of like pretty paintings on the walls, and not actually as another arts. The role of arts is actually another form of a medical intervention. So whether it's design, and it's research that shows that design of hospital rooms can result in shorter hospital stays. Whether it's the role of writing and treating depression, whether it's the role of music and ameliorating pain. There's actually a lot. We went through, 6,000 abstracts. We came up with like 667 ones that were actually good, that were on this evidence map. And basically we created this map. It was a beautiful map that was designed by someone who does visual data visualization up at Harvard, and you could click on it and get you were interested in palliative care and music. You can find the articles there, and And so it was really, really important. But in order to sort of realize, to get people who are stakeholders, like who are we doing this literature for, what are we doing this for, is that we were doing it because we want to enact change. Like we want to change policy. We wanted policy to be based on this. So we were doing it for hospital. We wanted to appeal to hospital administrators. We wanted to appeal to people, department heads. We wanted to appeal to insurers. We wanted to appeal to our people in government. So like, how do you do that? And what we learned in a lot of focus groups is that a lot of people like say, listen, I don't kind of get what you're doing. I don't get this particular artwork. I don't get this project, but I recognize research. Like I value research. So we realized that it was really important to sort of put these things, to be very, very explicit, to be very purposeful, and to be methodical about this. We also had engagement obstacles. It's like, how do we keep our stakeholders engaged during the entire process, from conceptualization of the idea to execution and to dissemination of the ideas? And then how do we deliver these recommendations that really appeal to a range of disciplines and a range of stakeholders? And then we also recognize there was an expertise obstacle, which is pulling together a whole bunch of really, really talented people from many, many different backgrounds. Doesn't necessarily always produce a productive partnership. And that the first thing we had to do was create this space where we valued voices that did not necessarily feel like they were empowered to speak up, and to really make sure that they were empowered to do this. So, yeah. And then we also, and this was a statement from the IWEM report. It goes, they said that interdisciplinary partnerships can be hampered by disciplinary silos, egos, and rigid institutional norms, which then makes you think about, like, where do you sit? Like, where do you fit in this? Like, how do you fit? Like, what do you do when you're outside these silos? And I think it's a challenge for us as clinicians, because there are sort of valued clinical areas, areas that we value in medicine that's really important for our clinical work. There are actually creative obstacles. So one is, like, we don't necessarily value failure. Two is that, risks is not something that we're naturally, we lean towards. And in fact, the best stressed people in the hospital are usually those people in that department called risk management. Art is by nature inefficient. It's actually built into the process. It's not an efficient process, and you have to give people time and space to be able to, like, go to take those tangents. It involves making, you have to be willing to go to those uncomfortable places. Expertise, like, you're always an apprentice. Like, I've been a writer for quite a while, and I don't know if I consider myself a writer. I really feel like I'm always learning. And in medicine, where we value outcomes so much, like, that's the whole thing. It's like, what's your outcome? We really have to start valuing process more and paying attention to those steps along the way. So what do we need to do? A couple of things is that, one, we need to normalize uncertainty in medicine. Uncertainty is not something that's bad. I think it's an area that it's a great place to start, and we have to become comfortable with that. We have to learn how to and teach our learners how to use uncertainty to their advantage. We need high-level ignorance. We always think about knowledge. We're so much knowledge focused, and filling that vessel with knowledge. This is a great book with Stuart Firestein, who's a professor at Columbia, in his book called Ignorance: How It Drives Science. And he said that, we actually need more. His argument is we need more ignorance. Like, science moves on ignorance. And the model we want to take is not that we want to start out kind of ignorant and we get some facts together and then we gain knowledge. It's rather the other kind of way around, really. What we need, what do we use knowledge for? What are we using the collection of facts for? We're using it to make better ignorance, to come up with, and if you will, higher quality ignorance. Because only in the areas that we don't know are we going to find answers. So not focusing on those things that we can identify. It's not those hearts or those butterflies flying off the screen. It's actually looking into those negative spaces, or spaces that that are not really apparent to us. We have to sort of realize and reframe problems than being stuck. Being stuck is actually not a failure. It's actually an opportunity. Some of the biggest breakthroughs that I've made as a writer are like when I feel like I'm stuck and I'm in a corner and I don't know how to get out. And that's when you really discover, like, who your characters are. You also discover a little bit about yourself and how you're thinking through problems. So there's great value of being stuck. The challenge is often it doesn't feel good. It feels crappy. And learning how to work through that feeling and that unease to actually use it in a positive fashion. And we need to map our decision-making process as an outcome. We focus so much more on outcomes, like I said, but I think what artists do is like they document their process. They keep a track of of the steps along the way, and I feel like that's so relevant. And the easy way to do this on a very simple way is actually keep a notebook. Not a notebook like a journal, not like a diary, just a notebook where you just jot things down. And even if it's we all have 5 minutes a day. And what you learn by keeping a notebook is that it's not about keeping a notebook. It's about paying attention. You realize that once you start writing things down, you start paying attention to things differently. You start looking at the world differently because you're getting granular. So one of my last quotes I'm gonna leave you with is this quote. I think this is the goal of should be of all medical education, medical training. We're committed to foster creative thinkers who innovate with ease, who are not rattled by uncertainty, who move agilely from one form of output to another, and who can communicate in multiple ways with acuity and clarity. And I feel like this is like, I put this up there and I've spoken at meetings and I've had like associate deans, some other people sort of nodding their heads. And then I play the bottom, then I press on the bottom, and it's a statement from Roseanne Somerson, who was actually the president of Rhode Island School of Design, and this is one of their missions of training art students. And so I think there's a lot of parallels in how we train artists and how we train physicians. And the last thing is that we should separate the idea of artistic creativity from creative thinking. Everyone is an artist. Every single person, and often what I'm talking about is not necessarily about acquiring skills, but allowing the skills that everybody has, the capacity that everyone has to sort of just flourish and to emerge. And I'll leave this with this quote from John Donahue, and he goes, "Everyone is involved, whether they like it or not, in the construction of their world. It's never as a given as it actually looks. You are always shaping it and building it." And so it's always a struggle. And I have to tell you that my work, as much as it has been incredibly rewarding, it's been such a struggle. It still is a struggle, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. And not only do I discover new things, but also discover things about myself. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to share this hour with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baruch. There are some questions in the chat, and there's been some discussion. Dr. Zink, I don't know if, since you started out with the first question, I don't know if you would like to facilitate that and speak to your question a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Your talks always just stimulate so much thought and great conflict, and I think in our minds. But so one of the things that when you were talking about getting the real story from the patient and kind of infusing, creative practices into patient interactions, it seems like that may take extra time. And many of our docs feel time pressure in terms of how many patients they need to see in a day or in a clinic, the 15-minute visit or whatever. Is there such a thing as efficient creativity? And are you able to how do you do it? What's been your practice in terms of getting that information by going a little deeper into the narrative of the patient?
Yeah, I actually had a slide on one of the first times I gave a talk on this, there was a professor emeritus who at dinner looked at me and he goes, like, "You talk about story," and I go, "Yeah," and he goes, "But you're a doc," and I go, "Yes." And he goes, "You have no time for story." And little I know, like 15 years later, like no one has time for story. I think there's a couple of things. So one is, this is not everybody. Some people, an ankle sprain is an ankle sprain. But I feel like what I've learned from this is having a barometer of my own unease. So I find that when I'm a little bit uncomfortable, I find myself cutting patients off. I'm trying to steer the direction in a particular way, so I'm aware of that. So one of the things I've done is when I feel like I let them talk. I'll let them talk for a little bit, and all times you realize that you think they're talking a long time, they're not taking a long time. Secondly, is that question I mentioned earlier, is I go, "Listen, walk me through your day." you know, and the person who will say, listen, I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I have this and I have that and I have that, and they walk me through their day, and I go, what did you have for breakfast? And they go, oh, I had cereal, you know, and they ate, like they're eating. The little things pop up. You get very particular, and then you discover that, like, and then I had an argument with my daughter or whatever, and then my belly started hurting. I came in, and so. So one is trying to figure out, like, you know, what is that step? For me, it's like, what made you come into the ER, which I realize it might be different for our colleagues who actually have scheduled appointments and people who just come in. Secondly is finding out, you know, finding out what their desire are, like what they want, because sometimes what we think they want is not necessarily what they want, you know. So I've had patients who have come in who you think they want a diagnosis, and they don't want to care about the diagnosis. They just want to feel better, you know. They want to be out of their misery. Sometimes what they want is no one's really talking to them, you know. So it's like getting a flavor of like what their need is, like what's most troubling them. And I never put it in the context of the medicine, the medical problem. And when I talk to residents, when I never say to residents, what do you think the patient has? That's like, I ask them, I literally say, like, what do you think's going on? And it opens up to questions. And there's a body of literature that says that oftentimes, you know, we just let patients talk a little bit longer. They'll give us the information that they want. I don't think it's necessarily about listening alone. I think it's about sort of being able to sort of help them, like ask different types of questions. And a lot of times the patients will say, listen, no one ever asked me that question before. So like getting specific, like what, like for me, is like, why'd you come in? Like, what can I, like even simple questions like, what can I do for you now? Like, how can I help you? And that's a very challenging term phrasing, because sometimes people feel like they're demanding something, and you're sort of questioning them as if there's nothing you really can do for them. And I also sometimes frame it from the perspective of what they're going to do, what's going to happen to them once they leave, and not like, I just want to get you out of here. It's like, so okay, so like, what are you going to do tomorrow? Like, what are you going to do tomorrow? If you didn't come in, what was going to happen? And sort of asking questions that have nothing to do with like their visit here, but actually has to do with the context of their symptoms and the context of their lives. Oftentimes give me some better insight.